Welcome everybody to the Animal Care Wednesday webinar. I'm Heidi Carroll. I work at SDSU Extension as a livestock stewardship field specialist. Today we are going to have Dr. Russ Daly as our June presentation. The Animal Care Wednesday webinars are a collaboration between Iowa State University Extension as well as University of Missouri. We typically focus on animal care and husbandry challenges across all livestock species and really look to provide information that will benefit Extension and 4-H personnel as we work with our clientele or address any big emerging issues that might be out there that we should be aware of when we're working with producers or youth with livestock projects. So just a couple of housekeeping items. You will be using the chat box to answer questions. If there's a small enough group, we can unmute when we get to the questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any challenges or have connectivity issues, feel free to use that chat box to communicate those as well. I also put the link to the Animal Care Wednesday webinar YouTube channel. That's where all of our recordings for the webinar presentations will be shared. So make sure that if you are not already a subscriber that you can click that link and you'll get notifications when the new recording webinar presentations are posted there. So let's go ahead and get kicked off with our presentation today. Our focus is on livestock diseases, and so the goal, we're going to kind of walk through balancing those threat of foreign animal diseases with the everyday drag of endemic diseases that our producers deal with. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Russ Daly, who's our Extension Veterinarian at South Dakota State University Extension.
All right, well, thanks for having me on today. So today I'm going to do something that I'm not really used to too much, and that's being very big picture in a presentation. My background is being a veterinarian in private practice before I came to SDSU, and so I'm used to dealing with individual animals and individual producers and the nuts and bolts of really working through animal disease issues. But I also, since I've been in extension and at the university doing a little bit of teaching as well, I do get the chance to once in a while kind of step back and take a bigger picture view. So my goal here today is to get us to think about what's the, where should we be placing our emphasis? Is there a way that we can kind of balance our worry about new emerging foreign animal livestock diseases with the things that probably more profoundly affect our livestock producers on a daily basis? So that's a big question. You hear about some very scary things in the news. With livestock diseases and foreign animal issues. So where should we really be placing our emphasis? So I hope at the end of the session we'll have a little bit more food for thought about some of the things that we should be thinking about. So with any kind of infectious disease issues, and that's what we're talking about here today. I'm not going to be talking about things that affect cattle in the feedlot regarding nutrition or parasitism or anything like this, but it's we're really going to focus in on the bugs, the infectious disease issues. So I can divide our disease worries into two different categories here, and I'll talk about endemic problems as well as foreign animal diseases. So foreign animal diseases, we'll define that later on, but you probably have a good understanding of what I'm talking about there. But endemic, that term just refers to those things that maybe not in every herd are present, but they're definitely present in the national herd or the regional herd. It's those diseases that are kind of a fact of life, a way of life in raising livestock. And anytime we have infectious disease issues of endemic nature or of a dramatic foreign animal disease issue, we deal with production losses. Diseases are drags on weight gain and milk production and reproduction. So there's a cost that goes with that. Both endemic problems and foreign animal diseases can create mortality, death losses. So we've not only lost the ability to market that animal that's died, but we've also lost that input costs that we've put into that animal to get it to that phase where they were. So all the feed and veterinary and other costs that go into that animal. But with endemic problems, we're dealing with treatment costs of these diseases. So anytime we have these issues in our livestock populations, we have to shell out money when they get sick. So we're treating them with antibiotics or different other preventative methods to prevent things from getting worse. And then we deal with a lot of prevention costs with our endemic diseases as well. And for example, we're vaccinating animals against pneumonia. We're vaccinating animals against PRRS. We're vaccinating animals against pink eye. Those everyday things that if we don't do, we have a chance of making the problems worse. So with foreign animal diseases, we definitely got production losses that can occur should they ever occur in the United States. Death losses, many of these are very dramatic with causing mortality, and that's why they're on our list of things we worry about. But we also, if those incursions ever happen in the United States, we have eradication costs. We're going to have to spend money to stamp that disease out to contain it. And then also along that line, we have to figure out where the disease is and where we can detect it. And in a sense, we're already paying money nationally to do some of these surveillance and detection before in order to keep these animal diseases out of our shores. So that's a cost of foreign animal disease that we're already kind of dealing with. So I just want to kind of step back and I've chosen some examples of endemic diseases that are problems. And when I look at these examples, so I got an example for cattle, I got an example for swine, I've got an example for poultry. The everyday things that really drag down our production, that really drag down our ability to keep animals healthy and to market them and be profitable entities. In thinking more in terms of livestock farms, but those of you who work with 4-H students and their projects know that there's other factors here as well. We can have real problems when those animals aren't healthy. So my first example is bovine respiratory disease, and I chose this for cattle because it is the most profound disease issue that we deal with in whether it's beef cattle or dairy cattle. Thinking more in dairy cattle with the growing animal, whether you're raising dairy beef cattle, calves, or raising a Holstein heifer up to the point where they can start being bred and making milk. So bovine respiratory disease, very much a multifactorial disease. There's bacteria and viruses involved. Most of those are bacteria and viruses that circulate and infect our animals very normally. And so they're there on a continual basis. The risk factor for bovine respiratory disease, as most of you know, is stress. When we wean animals, when we transport them, when we have weather issues, the stress of those issues creates a situation with the immune system that those bacteria and viruses that are normally present can take over and reach the lungs and cause signs of respiratory failure. So we even if we don't see the clinical signs, we deal with production losses in those animals pretty regularly. When they're subclinically affected, disease in the lungs does affect growth, even if we can't see that animal with a cough or a snotty nose. We definitely have issues with mortality with bovine respiratory disease too. We treat them with antibiotics. We use antibiotics sometimes in prevention, but most of our prevention is based on using vaccines, which can be helpful, but we also have situations where they do not show as much help. And I think more and more we're understanding the role of stress in animals, in cattle, in reducing the impact of bovine respiratory disease. So we're developing low stress cattle handling. Many of the things that have been discussed on this webinar really play into that very well. There's a drag on our pocketbooks with bovine respiratory disease to the tune of $800 and $900 million a year for the national cattle herd, and that's money that the industry, the farms could definitely make better use of, not having to deal with bovine respiratory disease. This is an issue that has been around for a long time. It's gotten worse when we started moving animals around. The first thing this was really called was shipping fever, and so that kind of plays into one of the big risk factors that we determined early on. And we haven't really gotten we've kind of nibbled around the edges on bovine respiratory disease, but we're really not there with eradicating it or preventing it in a big way. The endemic disease I chose for swine is called PRRS, Porcine Respiratory and Reproductive Syndrome. This is a virus, a specific virus that infects pigs, and there's a lot of other factors that go into the animal that can make it more susceptible to PRRS, but this is one of the examples that in the swine world of a single virus that really wreaks havoc. Our pork production, our genetics in our pork systems, the way we raise pigs really makes them, maybe just the species themselves, really makes them very susceptible to specific infections with viruses. So things like PRRS, PED, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, circovirus, these are all specific infectious diseases that really affect, and I could have chose those as well for this. Risk factor for bringing PRRS into a farm is new pig introductions. So most of the farms that raise sows and raise pigs from that in that segment of the industry are very careful about how they bring in new pigs, not just for bringing new pigs in that may carry PRRS into a herd. That's a huge issue. But also, how do you bring in a naive animal that has not been exposed to PRRS into a situation where there might be that virus endemically circulating in the farm? So while I put this as an endemic livestock disease, it's not something that uniformly affects all swine producers, like bovine respiratory disease would affect all cattle producers. PRRS causes production losses. When it first really hit, it was a very obvious problem in those infected herds. You saw a very rapid onset of pigs with respiratory loss and failure, and we saw sows aborting and having trouble with reproduction, very obvious. Now this disease has become more insidious, and it's more likely to be a constant drag on those infected farms. Being a virus, there's no treatment. And the prevention, we do have vaccines for PRRS, but they fall short. PRRS is a virus, one of those viruses that has very many strains to it. And the vaccines we have are currently very strain specific. An added kind of problem with vaccines is the effective ones that we have for PRRS are modified live. And so that increases the chance that you could actually bring that virus into a herd with a vaccine. And there's a price tag with this. Every year, this costs our pork producers one estimate. It seems like a very specific number, doesn't it? But $664 million a year. But just exemplifies how much of a drag that is on our national swine herd. And I kind of struggle a little bit to come up with a good endemic example for poultry. And for poultry, I'm talking about commercial poultry, not necessarily the backyard poultry, although they can be affected by these things as well. So I'm talking about layers and turkeys and broilers for the most part. And there's a pretty wide list of things that affect them. Most of the things that they get will be having some environmental components to them. And so housing becomes a risk factor. Definitely definitely all of these can result in mortality and production losses with a wide variety of treatments and preventatives. We do have antibiotics, anticoccidials that can be fed and put in the water for large barns full of poultry. And there are vaccines that we use mostly in the water for poultry as well. One of the interesting things that to me that's really prevented a lot of one of the reasons why we don't have one big example of a disease that endemically affects poultry is genetics. You know, we have a rapid turnaround time with the generations when we're talking about chickens and turkeys. And so in the back of my mind, one of the things that we really that industry has really worked on is the genetic robustness of the immune system. And so we've got to the point where with broiler chickens especially, we don't have too many diseases that affect them. When we do, it's kind of a breakdown in housing or management. They are very much almost kind of bulletproof. You know, they can't afford to have lines of broilers or turkeys even that become susceptible to disease just because there's a pretty short time of raising them. And so those are, but there are some problems that we deal with poultry every day. So those are some examples of endemic diseases, and I could pull out a lot of others that really are drags on our national livestock herd, as well as individual farms, as well as individual livestock owners, even if they have a few in the backyard. And so there's those costs that I put up there are just for those single diseases. Think about all the other infectious disease issues that can affect mortality and production losses. But now I'm going to shift a little bit to foreign animal diseases. And what is a foreign animal disease? Well, it's defined by USDA as they're defined as important transmissible livestock or poultry diseases believed to be absent from the United States and its territories that have a potential significant health or economic impact. So it kind of is what the term says. It's not something that we normally have in the United States, and so we have a very we're very cognizant about trying to keep those diseases out of our livestock populations. And it have a potential significant health or economic impact. So for the most part, we're really dealing with very contagious viruses because of the potential for them to move through a population of livestock very quickly. One of the things that's very especially scary about foreign animal diseases is unlike PRRS or respiratory disease or some of those poultry diseases that I mentioned before, our animals don't have a built-in kind of exposure and immune system built up against those things. So once these novel organisms come into the herd, we can have some, it really spreads through very quickly. And with very limited opportunities to kind of nip them in the bud. So we worry about importing animals. We can't bring in animals from many parts of the world because of their status with these types of animal diseases. Animal product importation, and what I mean by that is foodstuffs, that may harbor some of these germs that if they expose our national livestock herds, that there could be a risk of infection. I would extend that to other products that we import. One of the supposed ways that porcine epidemic diarrhea virus came to the United States was through transportation containers that may have held some animal feed that was used on our national herd. And then you're probably aware too of human travelers. So are as a risk of bringing in foreign animal diseases, just because these viruses are very contagious. Most of the time they're very hardy in the environment. They will survive a plane ride very well or a boat ride across the ocean very well. The health impacts on the national herd are very significant potentially, but we also understand that there's global trade implications. Once we have one of these diseases, now we're not able to export pork products or beef products to other countries. And that really speaks to the economic impact beyond just the production losses and the mortality for these issues. So just like with the other species, I thought I'd highlight one of the foreign animal diseases of interest for each one of them. I think the one we probably worry about more with cattle is foot and mouth disease. We've been lucky to avoid having foot and mouth disease in the United States since 1929. Like I mentioned, it's one of these viruses that's very transmissible, very contagious, pretty hardy in the environment. That presents a lot of different problems. Cloven-hoofed animals are the species at risk, so cattle and sheep and pigs. Transmission is through a lot of different venues, direct contact between animals, but again, it's hardy enough that it can survive being moved from one animal to another by clothing or equipment. So foot and mouth disease, what it does in the animals is cause blisters in the mouth and on the hooves. It does create kind of a debilitating issue for those animals that are not able to eat then. They don't feel like eating because of the sores in their mouth. And their ability to move around with the sore feet. In severe cases, this does create situations where animals have to be euthanized. And just from animal welfare standpoint, but for the most part, a lot of these issues do not cause a sudden death in these animals, for example. For kind of a peek into what this could mean if it were to come to the United States, in 2001 in the United Kingdom, 6 million cows or sheep were killed as a result. And that's not the death due to the disease. This is one of the ways that the government stamped out the disease or contained the disease, was to identify herds that were infected and remove them, basically removing the virus from potentially infecting other animals. So it became a very big thing. It is thought to have come in, and this gets to the one of the ways that these foreign animal diseases can come in, is one of the stories I've heard about this was that food was illegally imported. Human food was illegally imported from other countries, used in restaurants, catering kind of facilities, and then the trash gets the scraps get thrown out, and some of those make their way into the animal feed system, and that's one way that animals could become infected. So that's how some people think that this got started in the UK, because it was a foreign animal disease to them as well. The price tags I talked about with the endemic diseases were in the millions. This one, they figured back in 2001, was a $4.4 billion hit to the economy when everything was said and done. And so nowadays, the number would be higher, and especially in our high populations of cattle that we have, and pigs and sheep in the United States, it would be much more profound. And probably the newsiest foreign animal disease is African swine fever, and this affects swine. And so pork producers are very tuned into the possible effects of African swine fever. Again, this is a virus. There are different strains of African swine fever that result in different clinical patterns. So you have some strains that are very nasty and will kill pigs right away, and others will create some more milder infections. So for the clinical signs, we'll see high mortality on one end, subclinical infections on the other, and then everything in between. So it might not, the scary thing here is it might not be very apparent for a while whether African swine fever has started to infect our national herd or a specific animal population. It's one of these viruses that's very hardy, again, in the environment. Fortunately, it does affect pigs only, unfortunately for the pigs, but fortunately for cattle producers and sheep producers and that. The clinical signs, again, are not all that distinct. You can have pigs that just don't feel good. They have fevers, they just are lethargic. There is high mortality in some cases, but a lot of times you just see sick pigs that could be due to PRRS or some other infectious disease organism. Unlike foot and mouth disease, where we got blisters in the mouth, that's a little bit more of a distinct clinical sign that we can kind of hone in on. And China is still dealing with an outbreak of African swine fever in their national swine herd. It's been estimated that a quarter to half of their pig population has been lost due to death loss and depopulations. Some people in the United States believe that if it would come here, it would be a $50 billion a year price tag to the United States. And I put these numbers up just so you can kind of compare some of the different estimates and some of the different price tags that have been tallied in the past. $50 billion sounds like a lot of money, but $50 million sounds like a lot of money too. But if you can kind of put these in perspective with some of those other price tags, it does kind of become interesting. The foreign animal disease we're most worried about in poultry is highly pathogenic avian influenza, and we have had that occur in the United States. It does pop up once in a while. It is another virus, so there is a common theme here. We're talking about viruses that usually have to affect animals in order to perpetuate themselves, but these are examples of viruses that tend to have some hardiness in the environment, and they'll stay around. So the environment becomes an issue of transmission as well. We're talking about turkeys and chickens, mostly domestic poultry rather than backyard poultry, but it has affected wild animals, waterfowl as well. This is a virus that's transmitted through airborne means. When we had a big outbreak in the United States in 2015, it was still a little bit, I guess, unclear how that virus happened to hit us in the United States. But when we look at migrant bird populations and how they migrate through the center of the country and the West Coast, and how they can commingle with birds from Asia and their migration patterns. That's how we figure it probably got here to the United States back in that time frame. But once it was here, then and you had infected barns and people working with those animals, it was something that we did document how people could move it from barn to barn. And so that underscores the biocontainment part of this. What it does in animals, in the birds, we're usually talking about a very high mortality. We typically didn't see a whole lot of clinical signs. People would just go out and find dead birds in the barns. The price tag on the 2015 U.S. outbreak, which was fairly limited, it only happened a few months. But when it did, it affected 48 million birds, turkeys and layers mostly, and had a $3.3 billion price tag just in those few months. So it underscores how much of an economic issue these foreign animal disease incursions can result in. So to keep on with the foreign animal disease topic, how do we prevent them from coming into the United States and our animals? A couple ways that we can look at biosecurity and then biocontainment. So biosecurity to me means just what steps do we take as a nation, as a state, as a farm system, or as an individual location? What steps do we take to make sure that new disease issues don't come into a farm? And then biocontainment refers to, okay, it's here already. How do we keep it from spreading? How do we keep it within a farm, within a population, or within a country for that matter? How do we keep it from spreading, and how do we keep it from getting worse? So some of the ways that we look at biosecurity for foreign animal diseases are within the regulatory framework of the USDA and APHIS. So we spend a lot of time with, as I mentioned, animal importation rules. It's not easy to bring an animal into the United States from other countries. In some cases, in some species, it's impossible, which is good. You see the Beagle Brigade there, one of the members of the Beagle Brigade in the picture there. We do spend a lot of time policing people who come into this country with food products from other countries, because we know African swine fever and things like maybe even foot and mouth disease, those are ways that they could come into the United States, even in things that don't seem like they should be able to carry viruses. Most of these, the things I'm talking about are fortunately not zoonotic diseases. They only affect animals. So they could be present in cured meats and frozen meats also, which is very concerning. So we spend a lot of time trying to prevent that from happening, and then prevent things like this from being fed to animals or being exposed to animals as well. And anybody who's ever traveled overseas knows you get those questions. Have you ever been on a farm? When you come back to the United States, and so have you ever been on a farm overseas on your trip? And that's to mitigate the chance that you could track back a virus to the United States. So the question is, has it worked? Well, we've had incursions of foreign animal diseases. I mentioned avian influenza that we've had in the United States. That probably didn't come in with legally domestic imported animals. It was probably wildlife that brought that in. It didn't come in with food, and probably didn't come in with people. So it has some of these things have definitely kept out foot and mouth disease and African swine fever, for the most part so far. But we also have to understand that a couple of diseases I've already mentioned, PERS and PED, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, they were foreign animal diseases. They came from other countries. PERS came in the late 1980s and early 90s. About the time I was starting veterinary practice, it was very dramatic when it came in, but we know now that was probably a European virus that came in from another country somehow. No way of really knowing. We mentioned PED. That was something that was just known in other countries, in Asia, for example, and that came in probably through inanimate objects being imported from those other countries. So it's worked, and at the same time, it hasn't worked, and so we have to be ever vigilant to make sure we're staying on top of the viruses and the other issues that can come in. Biocontainment. Early detection is very important to me, I think, is one of the things we have to really look at. And everybody's involved here with early detection of a foreign animal disease. It starts at the livestock producer level. It extends to their veterinarian, and extends to the veterinarian calling state animal health and getting the federal diagnostic people involved as well. This is a picture of a cow that has blisters on the top dental pad of the mouth. This is not foot and mouth disease. This is epizootic hemorrhagic disease that occurred in South Dakota, right here in our backyard. This underscores the fact that these foreign animal diseases mimic normal diseases that we have present in our herds, and so that makes it very tough. Sometimes we're very complacent about these things, and we think, well, that's just something, that's just EHD, or that's just an animal that's ate a prickly weed, for example. That's why it's got that blister in its mouth. But it underscores the fact that we need to be calling our veterinarians, we need to be calling our state animal health staff to get these things checked out. We have a big a big infrastructure in place already to look at these things and just make sure that these things aren't, in fact, foreign animal diseases. The longer we kind of go on and think, that's going to get better or that's not a big deal, the longer a foreign animal disease can be established in the United States. I mentioned the veterinary diagnostic labs. Every state, virtually every state has an animal diagnostic lab. For example, ours is here in Brookings. And I wanted to also point out the National Veterinary Service Lab in Ames. This is a network of veterinary diagnostic labs that collaborates and can contribute to each other's kind of diagnostic needs as well. When Minnesota had so many avian influenza cases, they worked with us in Brookings, for example, to kind of take some of the overload. And NVSL is our reference lab. That's like our CDC for animals in Ames. And that's who we depend on for some of these very specialized animal diagnostic issues. But we do have the capability here, even in Brookings at our diagnostic lab, to test for avian influenza for sure, but also for African swine fever. We've done the testing. We're up to speed on how we would detect it in animals. And so we have to think about surveillance methods. This is a picture of pigs chewing on a rope and putting their oral fluids into that rope. So at what point do we do routine rope sampling for things like African swine fever? Because we know that it could be in a herd and not cause any overt issues until it can become very well established. So we have to think about ways that we can just kind of as a routine everyday kind of thing, maybe alongside with the endemic disease surveillance that we would use on a daily basis in herds, also be checking for some of these other important foreign animal diseases. So for the takeaway for us as extension people and as for livestock producers and as youth as well is know what those important ones look like. So African swine fever, foot and mouth disease, know what it would look like if it would come to our herd. So understand that. Observe animals regularly. I mean, I preach this all the time. I know you guys do too. The sooner we see something wrong with an animal, recognize it as something abnormal, cooperate with state officials, and communicate with our veterinarians and state officials, it's going to be much more better, much more of a chance that we'll nip something in the bud here. And then I kind of have kind of steered the conversation here today towards foreign animal diseases, but also understand that we need to work towards reducing these normal problems as well. So there's always things that we can do to understand things like PRRS and the poultry diseases and bovine respiratory disease. The more we can kind of get a handle on those endemic certain problems, the more we can probably easily detect a foreign animal disease that could be of great importance. All right, so that is all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Well, great. Again, use that chat box to type in your questions to get us rolling. Russ, one webinar is never enough when we start talking about diseases and obviously managing them. Do you think you could share just a couple of the best resources or web pages where we could encourage people to go to learn about each species disease or ways to monitor those?
Mm-hmm. Well, in order to know the important foreign animal diseases, I think the place to start is with USDA APHIS. They have some fairly brief fact sheets about the things that they keep on tabs of. So if USDA is trying to keep tabs on foreign animal disease, that's probably a good sign that we should too. After that, I would say I get the acronym right here, Center for Food Security and Public Health at Iowa State. is a very good, very comprehensive resource. And so if you want to know more about specific animal diseases and what they might look like, that's a site that would have good fact sheets and even good pictures to help understand what some of those things would look like.
Another question kind of that comes to mind too, we're obviously dealing with human diseases at this time. Do you believe there might ever be a shift in the prevalence of any of the diseases, maybe that you shared or others that come to mind, due to some really hard management decisions our producers might be making in the coming year?
Well, yeah, I think there might be. I don't know how profound or how permanent they're going to be. But for example, we've got disruption in the swine herd with the shutdown of a lot of the shutdown in the past of some of our packing plants, making some people have some hard decisions about euthanizing animals or looking for alternate markets for certain animals. For one example, what's happened there is that forward-thinking producers and their veterinarians can look at certain stages within their production. Say we've got an endemic issue in a certain nursery or a certain portion of our production system. Maybe that's the population to shift out of the regular stream. And give our buildings a chance, give our pig flow a chance to kind of calm down from PRRS would be the example I have in my mind, or other animal diseases, while alleviating that stress on the flow on the flow of pigs to the next stage in the operation. So in some ways, it's helped animal disease a little bit. I also think in the bigger picture of foreign animal diseases, what we've seen lately is a real reduction in mobility of people and travel. And so we're not, we're probably in a phase where we're not as worried about African swine fever coming in from a traveler from China or Southeast Asia, for example, as we once were. But we all know that's going to change and maybe even rebound the chance of something like that coming from another country when we get things back to the way they were.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but there's another one that comes to mind kind of along this here on your summary slide. I think producers may be more attuned to this. What would be some of your recommendations to help our younger 4-H FFA crowd, but we could help encourage them during this time? Surveillance can take many forms, not just the testing side, but implementing good daily observations and documentation there. What might be some of your recommendations that we could pass on to our younger beginning producers?
I think it's really a great opportunity for youth raising animals to get in that habit of knowing what's normal in animals, um, observing their animals, spending time with animals. And I say this for college students as well who are looking to go into livestock industries, is know what normal looks like. And so when you do see something that's abnormal, um, speak up. So being able to recognize it, that's the first step. So knowing what normal is, that's a big, huge first step. And then also starting to develop relationships with the veterinarians, and veterinarians in their local veterinarian can help them with some of that too, knowing when something is abnormal. And having that relationship with a local veterinarian will mean that they're going to be more apt to speak up and contact that veterinarian who can then kind of move things up the chain if something really dire happens. But yeah, knowing what normal is, and then understanding, what some of those foreign animal diseases look like, and understanding what steps are being taken on a national level, as well as what steps should be taken on an individual farm level for preventing new diseases of any kind from coming into an animal population.
No, that's great information. I appreciate the time that you take to put together some of these summaries for us to stay on top of things. I'm not seeing any last questions coming through, so I think we'll kind of wrap things up there. If you didn't get a chance to respond to the poll that you should be seeing on your screen, please just answer those couple of questions and give us your feedback. And please tune in for our next Animal Care Wednesday webinar, which will be September 2nd at 11 o'clock Central Time. We'll be talking about getting youth involved in small animal projects. And we also have our December 2nd Animal Care Wednesday webinar focusing on some show kid and lamb diet formulations. So a couple of things to put on your calendar for the future. With that, thank you for your time. I look forward to staying in touch during this remote work. And if you have questions or suggestions for future topics, please reach out to me.